Welcome, I am Marcus and this is Tier 1 Jank. We're going to be showing you a deck tech for Esper control in M19 standard. And the reason we're called Tier 1 Jank is for things like this. We have an Esper control build that is in a lot of ways like what you'll see in some Tier 1 control decks, but I don't like to run things that are just like all other Tier 1 decks. I like to change it up a little bit. I like to brew my own decks. Now a lot of what you see is, as I said, the same as what you'll see in some control builds, and that's because you can't get around using some of the best cards. But there are other things like Marionette Master that some people would consider jank that I think is a very good card, and it goes along with another card like Spell Swindle, which you will also not see a lot in normal standard play, but I think is a card that is really undervalued, and when paired along with a good control build, it can really show what some jank can do. I've done pretty well with this deck at my local F&M. It's beat a lot of the Tier 1 decks. Last week I got first place with it, beating out a blue-white control deck that is the standard net deck build that you would see. It did have a couple Gear Hulks in it, which not all of them do, but I also beat a red-green monsters deck, which has all of the cards that you would expect to see in that deck. And we also happened to play against one of Dev's decks, the Mono Blackburn, so I got that as well. Not a Tier 1 deck, but fun nonetheless. It's also, we'd normally come across all the other decks that you would normally see, red-black. This has come across and beaten Turbo Fog without a problem. But I'll go ahead and show you what we have here. Normal counter package, we have 4 Syncopates. Part of the reason for that is Turbo Fog. If you can hit their Nexus of Fate with the Syncopate and get it out of their deck into exile, there's not really much they can do about that. It also hits creatures turn 2 on the play. If you're on the play, you can take out anything that they're tapping out for. We have 4 Disallows. Those don't really need much comment. It's probably the best counter in standard right now. You can take out all different kinds of abilities and things. The Spell Swindle I mentioned. Now some people would think this is a very overpriced counterspell at 5, but what it does is give you a treasure equal to the converted mana cost of the spell that you're countering. So that can turn out to be pretty useful. We also have a couple negates. Those will usually have a target. They also help protect Teferi when he comes out and untaps lands. I don't have any Essence Scatters in here, which a lot of the packages normally run, but there's a lot of control in our meta, and I don't like it being a dead card against creatures without decks. So that's the reason I don't have it in here at the moment. As far as removal, we have 3 copies of Fatal Push, which you should be familiar with if you play Standard, and 4 copies of Vraska's Contempt, which also exiles creatures and planeswalkers and makes them not a threat if you're dealing with the recursion. We also have 2 Settle the Wreckage, which comes in very handy. As far as the other spells, we have a couple Blinks, Blink of an Eye, which will get things off the board if we need to counter them and they're already out, so, which also draws a card, as well as our other draw and filtering stuff, which is 2 copies of Glimmer of Genius and 2 copies of Search for Escanta. And then for our threats, we have Marionette Master, who I mentioned. I should probably explain exactly what she does. She costs 6, she comes in as a 1/3, but she has Fabricate 3, so we can choose to either make 3 servos, which we're not usually doing if we don't need to, or we can put 3 +1/+1 counters on her, which would make her a 4/6, and then her text reads that whenever an artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, target opponent loses life equal to Marionette Master's power. So, if you follow that line of play, she is 4 power with the 3+1/+1 counters on her. So anytime an artifact is going to your graveyard, say a treasure, your opponent would lose 4 life. So if you happen to be able to, say, spell swindle a 5 mana cost spell, have 5 treasures, and then resolve your Marionette Master the next turn, you can sacrifice all 5 of those treasures and your opponent will lose 20 life. It should be noted that even though they are tokens, treasures do hit the graveyard before they leave play, so they do count for her trigger. We also have a couple Torrential Gearhulks, which is an artifact that can trigger her. It doesn't happen as often as the treasures, but it is relevant. We have 2 copies of Teferi. He doesn't really need much explanation. He's one of the best cards in standard control right now. Even in modern control, he's seeing play. And he is not necessarily the main win condition in this deck, but he is useful and he will often take the opponent off of what I'm really doing, take their focus off. They have to worry about him as well as my other threats. I run more threats in this control deck than you often see in other control decks, and that's part of the reason. I don't like to have my opponent be able to stop one win condition and have me be out of the game. You'll see blue-white oftentimes runs just Teferi. I couldn't see myself doing that, but that is a good deck. I also have 1 copy of Approach of the Second Sun, and again, that's just one more backup win condition. It can be a factor in control mirrors, and sometimes against more creature-centric decks, it can buy you the extra time that you need, even if it doesn't win you the game. As far as the mana pack goes, or the land pack here, you'll see most of your basics for Esper control. We have 3 of each basic land, some lands that produce both colors, the Fetid Pools, Drowned Catacombs, Irrigated Farmland, Glacial Fortress, Isolated Chapel, 1 copy of Field of Ruin for problem lands, and most notably a Detection Tower. Now, not all of you may be familiar with that or run that. It reads that you can tap it for a colorless mana, or 1, tap it, and until the end of your turn, your opponents and creatures your opponent control with hexproof can be targets of spells and abilities you control as though they don't have hexproof. Now, the reason this is in the deck is there are a lot of hexproof creatures in standard right now. This will let me be able to target things like Carnage Tyrant, Vine Mare, and yes, it even works against things like Knight of Grace that have hexproof from black. Even though it says hexproof from black and not just hexproof, this takes care of that as well. And that is the deck. We are going to be doing a deck tech of Leslie's deck as well here, and hopefully be running a match between them. So I hope you'll join us for that as well. Thank you.